let's go to these protests and let's have a look at the size of the protests in each of our major cities this weekend. Starting with Sydney. This is Sydney. Yesterday, the protest had an estimated 20,000 people. It stretched right from the town hall right into the inner west suburbs. It was just extraordinary. Then in Victoria, there were more than 10,000 people took to the streets to protest Black Lives Matter. And in Brisbane, there were estimated to be 30,000 people on the streets. Look at those crowds, just enormous. And all of this at a time when we are in a global pandemic over a virus that health officials have told us is the worst in a century, and mass gatherings have been banned. When making the call to lift restrictions, the biggest worry our health experts and politicians had was of a second wave of the coronavirus. That's why they said social distancing is so important, why restaurants can't be at full capacity, why our borders are still closed, and why we can't travel to some states.
The message is very clear that the health risks of gathering in such large numbers and the risks of people coming into close proximity are real.
The protesters could not guarantee adherence to the health orders. They could not guarantee safe social distancing, and simply the number of protesters far exceeds the health orders.
Do not go, do not attend. There is a better way.
Those gatherings do present a risk.
Enough people have been hurt. Let's not do anything on the weekend that compromises safety. Let's not do anything on the weekend that potentially spreads the virus.
Now, it doesn't matter what these protesters are protesting, and I'll come back to the Black Lives Matter movement in a moment because it is incredibly important. But the subject matter here is not relevant because these protesters are breaking the ban on mass gatherings. They're risking their lives along with everyone else's. And they could easily unravel all of the good work that we've done as a collective over the past 11 weeks. They could very well be responsible for a second wave of the virus. And if that happens, grandparents who gave up seeing their grandkids, it all would have been for nothing. Business owners whose doors have permanently shut, all for nothing. Millions of people who have lost their jobs, people who have been in physical pain because elective surgeries were cancelled, for nothing. People who died alone in nursing homes or in hospital isolation wards without even their partner for comfort, on ventilators, alone and scared, for nothing. Like you, I am disappointed and saddened and angry by the protesters who care so little for their fellow citizens, so little for our society and for the health of our loved ones, that so little that they're prepared to selfishly risk it all by having a mass gathering, flouting the social contract we've made to all do our bit for the good of society. It's a point Matthias Cormann made this morning on Sky News.
It's quite irresponsible what we've seen there. And I can't, as I think about the heartbreak of families who haven't been able to attend funerals for their loved ones because they were doing the right thing by taking the health advice, my heart just goes out to them. As they see people recklessly going to these sorts of demonstrations, that must be just awful for them to watch. I think it is incredibly selfish, it's incredibly self-indulgent, and yes, it does impose unnecessary and unacceptable risk onto the community.
And remember, restaurants still have to abide by social distancing rules, and for many, that means it is not cost-effective to open their doors. Gyms and health clubs, yoga classes, they only reopen next week, and even then, they're only allowed to have 10 people per class. So why is the right to protest greater than the right to get married or be at someone's funeral when they pass away, or pay our respects on Anzac Day? As columnist David Pemberthy pointed out in The Australian this weekend, despite the protests of tens of thousands of people across the country, he wrote, "You will, of course, still be fined if you let your daughter have more than 20 guests at her 18th birthday." So where are our politicians in all of this? Our political leaders were willing to let your business suffer or go under in order to enforce these restrictions. They were happy for you to give up your privacy by downloading an app so that they could track your movement or the movement of your mobile phone. They're happy to demand to know where you're going when you're simply driving on the street, and happy to tell you to get up from a park bench when you're breastfeeding your baby, or to move on when you're sitting by yourself in the park reading, causing no harm or danger to anyone. They're happy for you to forgo seeing your grandchildren, visiting your family, or celebrating a marriage. But will they protect you from a mass gathering that could bring about a second wave of COVID-19? They will not. Only New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian went to court to try to stop the protest from going ahead, but this was overruled on appeal. You have every right now to question whether you need to follow any rule at all that's being imposed on you. Why should you have your privacy tracked? Why should you obey a single social restriction the government is enforcing on you that you don't agree with? Now, to understand just how dangerous from a health perspective these protests are, let's look at the comments of a professor of social and natural science at Yale. He's the author of The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. He's made some compelling points, and he's done a big thread about it on Twitter. He was speaking about the protests in the United States, but the same applies here in Australia. He said the 1918 flu pandemic had a famous example of a mass gathering. It was to support a parade for World War I in Philadelphia. He wrote, "The outcome was much more death compared to other cities." He said COVID, unadjusted, killed 1 out of 1,000 of all New Yorkers in 2 months, but it killed 3 out of 1,000 of all Black New Yorkers. That's just the first wave. He wrote, "It's known COVID is an immediate threat affecting minority and vulnerable populations, for example, the elderly and the sick." He went on, he wrote, "So let's be clear, it's not just about protesters or anyone joining any kind of large gathering, willingly assuming a risk to their own lives from a contagious disease. It's that during an outbreak, their actions impose risk on others, including the most vulnerable." He wrote that protesters themselves may be at relatively lower risk of dying of COVID per se, being young on average. But even outdoors and masked, they will bring the virus home to others and contribute to the spread. He concluded, more deaths will result than otherwise. More deaths than otherwise will result. Hard to say how large a bump and how much it will be due just to these understandable protests, but I think we will see a new wavelet in 4 weeks, that is, after 2 transmission links, given the youthful age of the protesters themselves. According to the protesters, Black lives matter, but apparently the lives of the elderly don't. The lives of people with a respiratory condition do not matter either. The lives of the medically vulnerable, our frontline workers, our nurses and our doctors, our hospital cleaners and food preparation staff, and anyone over 60, no, apparently they don't matter as much. And neither does the risk to your business or the ones you work in of shutting down completely again. And no, apparently it doesn't matter if you can't feed your family. None of that matters. Not enough to protest in a different way, online, through giving actual money, actual monetary donations, through petitions, through mass emails to politicians, or getting involved in a not-for-profit and doing legwork to make a difference to address racism in our society or in the justice system. But that's all seemingly too hard for these protesters. We have to confront the fact that our community, our society, has been badly let down by our selfish fellow citizens and by our weak political leadership. It's important also to remember which communities are among the most vulnerable to COVID-19 infections.
We know that Indigenous Australians, as a general principle, have higher comorbidities, lower life expectancy. That is one of our great tasks, and it would be a terrible irony if, as we pursue the national goal of increasing the health of Indigenous Australians, there is a protest which put that health at risk. There may well be many people associated with Indigenous Australia, and if they attend a mass gathering, they then risk taking that back to their elders and their elderly, people who may be more vulnerable than others.
Make no mistake, George Floyd's murder was horrifying. and the struggle of Black Americans and our Indigenous people must be addressed, and urgently, but not in a way that will risk even more lives. When you look at the health advice, it's worth asking the question of these protesters, do Black lives matter to you? And if they do, then surely the better response is not to have a mass gathering, but to stay home.